Danielle Moore, a black doctor who graduated with honors and had saved hundreds of lives, was handcuffed like a thief in a parking lot, dismissed as if she were faking it when she needed medical help. But the two racist white officers had no idea. The woman they humiliated that day was the wife of a colonel commanding a national-level tactical response unit. And once the truth came to light, the cost wouldn't stop at an apology. Before delving into the story, write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The sky over Atlanta was strangely gray that afternoon, as if the air itself sensed something was about to go wrong. Danielle Moore had just stepped out of the bookstore on the mall's second floor, carrying two carefully wrapped paper bags in her arms, each in her son's favorite color, deep ocean blue. She had chosen the gift with care, a human heart anatomy model, a subtle way of nurturing the spark of scientific curiosity her almost 8-year-old had been showing lately. She smiled faintly at the thought of his surprised face when opening the box, that look. She'd seen it so many times before, at the dinner table, on the living room couch late at night when she pushed through exhaustion just to read him a bedtime story. But that joy didn't last. As Danielle approached the ground floor parking lot and opened her car trunk, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed behind her, making her glance back slightly. Two police officers, both white men in their 40s, one with sunglasses pushed up onto his forehead, were walking toward her with sharp, suspicious eyes that didn't bother to hide their assumptions. She hadn't even placed her bags in the trunk when one of them spoke. "Ma'am, you just came out of the jewelry store on the South End, correct?" Danielle frowned. "No, I was at the bookstore. She didn't get to finish the sentence before the other officer cut in, his tone colder. "Let me see your ID." She nodded, opened her purse, and pulled out two items, her state ID and her hospital-issued physician's badge, complete with photo and digital signature from Atlanta Medical Center, where she worked. She held them out calmly. But their eyes didn't go to the documents. They went to her skin. Brown. Their skeptical stares made it clear they saw no more than a flyer in her hands. "This looks weird," one of them remarked, holding her badge between two fingers as if it were contaminated. "You're saying you're a doctor, dressed like this, walking out of a high-end shopping mall?" Danielle froze. She was wearing jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and a light jacket. Nothing flashy, nothing torn, nothing disheveled. She knew that tone. It wasn't about the clothes. It was about where someone like her was allowed to exist. "I have the receipt from the bookstore," she said, her voice steady but soft. "And I didn't go into any jewelry store. I can even show you the security camera that caught me leaving Barnes & Noble." But they weren't listening. One of them grabbed her arm. The other yanked the bags from her hand. Danielle didn't resist. Instead, she responded with a steady voice, "Please stop. I'm Dr. Danielle Moore, a cardiothoracic surgeon at Atlanta Medical Center. I can contact my attorney if necessary." That statement only fueled the fire already burning in their heads. One of them laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "You people all say that." Without warning, he twisted her arm behind her back and clamped on the cuffs. As the metal snapped shut around her wrists, a cold surge shot down Danielle's spine. Her heart rate spiked like a machine thrown out of rhythm, thudding fast and fierce as if rebelling against the body, trying so hard to stay composed. This wasn't the adrenaline of pre-op nerves. This was something else entirely, an involuntary, physiological response rising from the deep well of memory and fear. The tightening in her chest spread from her sternum to her throat, pressed into her jaw, then radiated to her left ear, muffling her hearing into a dense, distorted hush. Cold sweat seeped through her shirt, slid down her back, and broke out across her temples. Her body sent clear textbook signals, the kind she'd lectured about many times, an acute stress reaction, with a real risk of triggering cardiac complications. The two officers, paused momentarily when they noticed Danielle's sudden physical change. Just a brief flicker, but long enough to catch the flash of concern in the younger one's eyes. Travis Kellogg. Still, that flicker vanished the second Scott Baines, the older and more seasoned of the two, shot him a warning glare, then turned his attention back to Danielle. Meanwhile, Danielle was fighting a very real battle within her own body. Instead of being swept up by emotion, she defaulted to what had been ingrained in her by years of medical practice. She checked her breathing, shallow, uneven, restricted by intercostal muscle spasms. The pain pattern wasn't classic, but it radiated wide enough to qualify as atypical chest pain, the kind that had brought hundreds of patients into the ER too late. Given her medical history, she knew how thin the line was between a physiological response and a full-blown cardiac event. Just a few missed minutes could mean no way back. Where most people might have spiraled into panic, she shifted into command mode, as if standing in an emergency or, only this time, the patient whose life depended on her was herself. The words left Danielle's lips with the clarity and precision of muscle memory, cutting through the heavy air of the parking lot like a scalpel. I'm experiencing an acute, hypertensive response triggered by psychological stress. The chest pain is localized at the sternum, accompanied by cold sweats and shortness of breath. I need an immediate ischemic risk assessment. If I can reach EMT support, I can help evaluate my symptoms. Another performance. Cut to the act, Baines muttered, his voice a tired blend of mockery and disdain. Danielle lifted her chin, her eyes locked on Baines. Though her hands were cuffed behind her, her posture held steady. Her gaze wasn't loud. It didn't beg. It radiated a quiet force that would make anyone truly paying attention feel a chill. This is not a performance. I am describing a legitimate medical condition, and every detail I've stated can be verified by camera footage and my medical records. Everything I say here will be reflected in legal documentation. That voice, firm, sharp, had echoed through many operating rooms before. But this time, it wasn't meant to guide others through a surgery. It was fighting to save its source, dragged into a role she never chose, in a script written generations before her time. Scott Baines sneered. To him, credentials couldn't erase color. A black woman could be brilliant, accomplished, stacked with professional accolades, and still, in his eyes, she was someone who needed to be controlled. Travis remained silent, his eyes flickering like a man caught between two worlds, his conscience and his orders. The pressure in Danielle's chest began to ease. Her breathing settled, her body regained control. Without medication, without a monitor or support, she had pulled herself back from the edge of cardiac complications with nothing but knowledge and the steel will honed by years in the operating room. It was a quiet but powerful victory, a reminder that no one could decide her fate based on prejudice unless she gave them silence. Under the fading light of dusk, the physical pain had subsided, but what lingered, the wound to her dignity, the sense of being seen as a stranger in a space she had every right to inhabit, would follow her much longer. And if anyone thought that this moment would break her, they clearly didn't understand what could rise from a black woman pushed to her limit. Without a word, Scott Baines yanked her cuffed arm and dragged her toward the patrol car, as if escorting someone with a violent history. Her back struck the metal door with a dull thud, but Danielle made no sound. Travis followed slowly behind, his gaze flickering with discomfort every time he saw how she was being treated. But his feet kept moving, like a machine no longer driven by his own will. Baines opened the back door and pressed Danielle's head down, a routine maneuver to control suspects, even though she hadn't resisted once. Her left knee slammed against the seat's edge, sending a sharp burn through the fabric of her jeans. In the cramped back seat, the smell of old sweat and synthetic plastic filled her nose. Light from the outside disappeared as the car door slammed shut with a final, brutal thud, like a full stop on her autonomy. During the entire ride to the precinct, no one asked how she was doing. Danielle sat still, wrists burning, back pressed against the barrier behind the front seats. Every bump in the road felt like a reminder that to the men in the front seats she wasn't a doctor, wasn't a mother shopping for her child, just a misplaced figure being returned to her proper place. Minute by minute, the air in the car grew thicker, as if even it had absorbed the weight of prejudice. Somewhere else in the city, the first signal from Danielle had just been sent, and the one who received it was the only person with enough clarity, authority, and conviction to make sure this wouldn't be buried like so many cases before it. Inside the main conference room at Fort McPherson, Colonel Marcus Grant sat listening intently to a situation update from a Navy lieutenant colonel, his hand holding a pencil but barely moving. On the screen, priority defense zones stretched from the Chesapeake Bay to the eastern coastline. The meeting had been called urgently under a joint agency directive, a high-level strategy session where every officer was expected to maintain absolute focus. But Marcus wasn't fully in that room. In front of him lay a classified report delivered that morning, nearly 40 pages thick, a list of state and local law enforcement officers under scrutiny for suspected abuse of power, bribery, and systemic racial profiling. Marcus wasn't the first to read it, but he was the one tasked with drafting recommendations for military coordination in the event of an interagency anti-insider threat response. He had skimmed the list as the meeting went on. Among the sea of names and ranks, two stood out just long enough to make his eyes pause: Officer Scott Baines and Officer Travis Kellogg. The note beneath read, "At least 5 complaints regarding race-based detainment. Under internal review, never formally disciplined." That was when his phone buzzed, 6 times in rapid succession, then went silent. Not believing in coincidence, Marcus pulled the phone from his breast pocket. 6 missed calls from Danielle. The spacing between each call was less than 3 minutes. He rose from his seat and requested to step out, but the expression on his face ensured no one asked why. Outside the conference room, he immediately opened the tracking app installed the previous year, an agreement between him and Danielle after she had once been followed on her drive home from a night shift. The red dot pulsed. Not at the hospital, not at home. It sat deep in South Atlanta, directly at the location of Precinct 18. A cold ripple moved down his spine. Danielle was composed. She didn't call 6 times in a row over something minor. And she wouldn't be at a police station unless something serious had happened. Marcus didn't leap into his car and race off. Instead, he sat back down, reopened the report, and scrolled until he found those 2 names again. Scott Baines, Travis Kellogg. He reread the lines, committed them to memory. There was no concrete proof yet, but something heavy began to settle inside him. A connection forming between those names, the red dot on the map, and the missed calls from the woman he loved more than his own life. On his way to his private office, Marcus searched through the internal operations database, quickly pulling case records tied to lawsuits involving Precinct 18, one of the most quietly criticized units in the city for its long-standing pattern of racial bias. Every single case had been handled internally, and none ever made public, and all of them pointed to Precinct 18. His hands clenched, but his voice remained calm as he called his trusted aide, Major Grace Holloway. "Grace, I need CCTV footage from around Atlanta Mall and Precinct 18. Find out if anyone named Danielle Moore was taken into custody there." "Is something wrong, Colonel?" Grace asked, but Marcus didn't respond. Silence stretched over the line like a held breath. Driving through the city, Marcus watched Atlanta blur past the windshield. He loved this city, its streets, its corners. but he also knew its other side. The hidden layers of fractured systems where the color of your skin could decide how a police officer asked for your name. Inside the intake room of Precinct 18, the cold fluorescence overhead cast a sterile, almost chilling light across the mottled gray tile floor. What was meant to be a space for routine administrative procedures now felt like the quiet stage of an unspoken tribunal. Danielle Moore, a cardiothoracic surgeon and state-level medical award recipient, was being forced to sit on a wooden bench against the wall, hands cuffed behind her back, shoulder tilted from being shoved while entering the building. Her everyday clothes, now distorted by the imbalance of her posture, made her entire body seem locked into a frame designed for suspects. In front of Danielle, Officer Hank Rollins flipped through intake documents with visible disinterest, not lifting his head once. When he reached the occupation field, he finally looked up, his eyes tinged with doubt and sarcasm, then yanked a leather wallet from a nearby folder, pulling out her medical credentials. Without even inspecting them, Rollins let the badge drop to the floor like an old hotel keycard. The hard plastic hit the tile and skidded, tapping against the leg of a steel chair. Danielle glanced at it, her eyes still firm, but her lips pressed so tightly they turned white. The insult wasn't in the act of discarding the ID. It was in the silence that followed, the way the room accepted it as routine. Across the room, a young female officer leaned against the file counter. Lindsay Walker, barely a year out of the police academy, stood with her hands clasped at her stomach, fingers twisting slightly. She had seen it all. The vague accusations, the indifference from colleagues, the way Baines barely nodded when asked for paperwork. Growing up in a conservative white family in Savannah, Lindsay was no stranger to coded words, the knowing pats on the back, and the quiet satisfaction when a clean outcome was handled off record. But in Danielle's eyes, she saw something that made her chest tighten. Not rage, but the unmistakable sense of betrayed dignity. Lindsay wanted to speak. She had nearly stepped forward more than once, but each time, the shadow of Scott Baines, his domineering tone, his ice-cold stare, rose in her mind like an unspoken warning. She knew that even one word of dissent could send her career down a different path. Yet, in that moment, the reason she had chosen to wear the badge in the first place began to press heavily on her chest. She had once believed she could be the change this system needed. Danielle lowered her head, shoulders twitching as pain from the cuffs traveled up into her joints. Since stepping into that building, she hadn't screamed, hadn't cursed. She remained silent, not out of resignation but out of clarity. She knew that every word she spoke would be filtered through the lens of bias held by those in charge. They didn't see a surgeon. They didn't hear a woman trying to explain. They saw a black woman in casual clothes, in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that was all it took to be treated as someone evading justice. Outside the precinct, Andre Collins, a young attorney with the human rights group Equal Liberty, leaned against his car, eyes fixed on the precinct's front entrance. He had witnessed the entire incident, how Danielle was grabbed in the mall parking lot by two officers. He had only stopped by to visit the bookstore, but the mix of calm and shock in Danielle's reaction had drawn his attention instantly. He began recording within seconds. Andre wasn't the kind of lawyer who sought out confrontation. He believed in the power of evidence, of image, of doing what was right even when the system deliberately did wrong. Years with Equal Liberty had taught him that most victims of racial injustice didn't die from a blow or a bullet, but from the prolonged silence of witnesses, of colleagues, of those who could have spoken but didn't. Now, Andre waited, not rushing, not shouting. He knew that walking into the precinct with just a bar card and no plan would land him in a space where no one listened. He needed to know who he was up against. He needed to understand the power structure inside to know when the timing would be right. Most importantly, he knew exactly who Marcus Grant was. An hour earlier, after seeing Danielle forced into the patrol car, Andre had found her name on the ID card discarded at the scene and quickly searched public databases. When he read the words, cardiothoracic surgeon at Atlanta Medical Center, wife of U.S. Army Colonel Marcus Grant, he knew immediately that this incident would not be buried like so many others. Inside the precinct, Lindsay finally bent down and picked up the medical badge. She brushed the dust off gently, her confused gaze drifting toward Danielle. No one else in the room noticed that small act, but in that moment, the first crack in the wall of silence appeared. Outside, Andre hit send on the full video, dispatching it to an encrypted email address, its recipient none other than Equal Liberty's internal rapid response unit. Attached was a single line of text: urgent, unlawful detainment in progress. Initiate Phase 1 legal action. None of them knew yet that within the suffocating silence of that police room, a wave had already started to form, and it would not stop until the system was forced to reckon with the very darkness it had long cultivated. The glass doors of Precinct 18 shuddered slightly as Andre Collins stepped through them. The air inside held a stale blend of old air conditioning, cold coffee, and the ambient noise of law enforcement, keyboard clacks, fragmented conversations, and urgent phone calls delivered with indifferent monotony. But this time, the space carried an added tension, thick, unnamed, and heavy with something just beginning to shift. Andre adjusted the collar of his blazer, fingers holding a simple but authoritative business card. Andre Collins, Attorney at Law, Equal Liberty Civil Rights Division. The name of the organization printed on the card, Equal Liberty, was enough to make many in law enforcement instinctively wary. He approached the reception desk, presented his credentials, and spoke just loud enough to be heard. "I'm here regarding an unlawful arrest. I'd like to speak with the supervising officer on duty." The young officer at the desk glanced at the card, hesitated, then radioed in quietly before nodding and motioning Andre toward the interior corridor. The second door led to the administrative offices where Lieutenant Raymond Harris, the watch commander, sat at his desk. Harris was a seasoned man, soft-voiced but firm, someone who had long learned to walk the tightrope between protocol and conscience. He looked up as Andre entered, his eyes narrowing slightly in assessment. But, instead of suspicion, he offered a brief nod. "Take a seat, Counselor Collins. I've been told you're here to review a detainment from the mall." Andre sat down and placed on the desk two things: a printed video, still from the parking lot recording, and a copy of Georgia's police procedure statute concerning arrests made without direct evidence. He didn't need a long speech. The footage spoke for itself. Danielle was pulled by the arm, her credentials tossed aside, and her clear verbal confirmation of her location at the time. Harris studied the materials carefully, his face unreadable, though a crease began to form between his brows. He pulled up the arrest logs on his computer. On screen, suspect description: black female, approximately 5'9", dark brown jacket, dark slacks, exited, crystal jewelry at 17:08. He glanced again at the footage from Andre. Something in his posture shifted, but his voice remained steady. "I'll bring the involved officers and the detained individual into the conference room." An hour later, the small meeting room off the main hallway felt crowded with 4 people. Lieutenant Harris sat at the center, Andre to his right, Danielle Moore at the far end of the table, with Scott Baines and Travis Kellogg standing to either side, posture formally stiff but their eyes already beginning to shift and flicker. Danielle didn't wait to be prompted. She stepped forward and gently placed a receipt on the wood in front of Harris. It was from Barnes & Noble, time-stamped 1704, her name printed clearly beneath the customer ID. Her words followed, crisp and precise like a clinical presentation. At approximately 17:06, I exited the bookstore. According to the suspect profile, the alleged individual left crystal jewelry at 17:08. That's less than a 3-minute gap and nearly 3 storefronts apart. I request surveillance footage from the ground floor to confirm my path and location. There was no flourish in her tone, no excessive emotion. Each point was placed with surgical accuracy, clean, sharp, leaving no room for dismissal. Andre remained silent, his eyes fixed on Danielle, not in defense, but in witness. He was watching a defense of dignity unfold, executed with intellect and unwavering poise. She didn't need anyone to speak for her. That was clear in every breath she took. Danielle turned, facing Baines directly. His gaze faltered. She didn't raise her voice, but her words cut through the air with the weight of steel. I presented my credentials from the outset. I described my medical condition and the risk of complications due to stress. Both of you chose to ignore that. Instead of following the procedure, you applied force and dismissed every piece of professional information I offered. That wasn't negligence. It was the result of a bias you've chosen to maintain. Travis stood silent, hands clasped behind his back, eyes on the floor. Baines, trying to maintain his composure, leaned backward subtly, as though retreating from the line of sight. Lieutenant Harris opened the precinct's camera logs, syncing them with footage sent in from the mall. In a zoomed-in frame, Danielle appeared, exiting the bookstore, carrying blue shopping bags, her head slightly lowered, walking calmly. Every visual detail contradicted the suspect description. A different jacket, different timeline, opposite direction. The room fell into a strange stillness, like the pause before a heart restarts its rhythm. Harris turned to Baines, his voice now stripped of courtesy. "Would you like to revise your report?" Baines clenched his jaw, the face he usually kept cold and unreadable now flushed with unease. His efforts to hold dominance only amplified his exposure under the weight of clear evidence and irrefutable logic. Across from him, Travis's eyes had drifted to the corner of the room, as if finally facing the consequences of a decision he once thought would be quietly covered up like so many before. Danielle didn't wait for another word. She calmly picked up the receipt, folded it, and tucked it into her jacket pocket before leaving the room. Her stride was as steady as it had been on entry, but the air behind her carried something different now, heavier, deeper, and beginning to shift the layers of a system long overdue for reckoning. The steady sound of military boots echoed against the tiled floor like the pulse of a barracks jolted awake. As the glass doors of Precinct 18 opened, the entire front desk area shifted its energy. Officers on duty stood at attention, not from volume, nor any spoken command, but from the presence of the man walking in. On the left side of his uniform chest was a U.S. Army badge. Colonel Marcus Grant, commander of the Southeastern Tactical Response Division, a veteran of Middle Eastern campaigns, a man whose presence alone could bring an entire base to high alert. He didn't need to introduce himself. Every step carried the calm gravity of military discipline and the unshakable authority of a man who operated with both command and purpose. His gaze swept across the room like he was scanning a terrain he'd mapped 1,000 times during emergency briefings. But this time, the briefing wasn't at the Pentagon. It was inside a local precinct, where his wife had just endured a humiliation wrapped in the guise of procedure. As he reached the corridor leading to the administrative wing, Marcus stopped in front of the conference room. Lieutenant Harris had stepped out only minutes earlier. Harris turned, still carrying the lingering weight of Danielle's razor-sharp deconstruction. When he saw Marcus, he froze slightly, straightening his back as his voice slowed by instinct. "Colonel Grant." Marcus nodded. "No wasted motion. I need to review all footage and documentation concerning the arrest of Danielle Moore." He didn't have to say it. Harris already knew exactly who she was. The clarity between what he'd seen on the monitors and what his memory told him from Marcus's military record left no room for doubt. Silently, Harris gestured for Marcus to follow him into the operations room. Danielle had not yet left the building. She stood by the east corridor window, where the fading afternoon light cast across the red marks around her wrists. The raw imprint of handcuffs tightened too far when she was dragged in. She heard the measured rhythm of footsteps she knew by heart, and for a beat, her pulse slowed. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. She knew who was walking toward her. When Marcus reached her and their eyes met, the distance between them seemed to dissolve. There was no dramatic run, no tearful embrace like in tired films. Danielle turned, and in her gaze he saw a depth, a steadiness, and a silent reservoir of emotion she had kept tucked away like a refuge no one else was allowed to enter. But now, before Marcus, the steel shell she had worn into that hearing room began to crack. He stopped close, just near enough that if she needed to lean, she could. They didn't speak. Marcus glanced at her wrists at the dark bruises still fresh. He touched them gently. So gently as if any pressure might disturb not just the surface injury, but the deeper wound beneath, the dignity crushed and swallowed over the past hour. Danielle held his gaze for a moment longer, then blinked, lips pressed together, and quietly rested her forehead on his shoulder. It wasn't a weakness. It was an anchor dropped in the middle of a storm, an exhale from someone who had held too much for too long. Marcus wrapped his arms around her, eyes never leaving the conference room door. Each heartbeat he felt against his chest struck like a distress signal from a battlefield where the law failed, where people were treated as threats based solely on skin. He asked, not loudly, but in a tone so deep and weighted it pulled the entire hallway into silence, like a shooting range seconds before a drill. Who authorized the detainment? Lieutenant Harris stepped forward, his previously neutral expression growing heavier. He pointed toward the file. The two responding officers, Baines and Kellogg, stated the subject matched the description. Marcus nodded. And where's the corroborating evidence? Harris didn't respond. He didn't need to. Marcus had sat beside him 3 minutes earlier, watching the surveillance footage together, Danielle leaving the bookstore, receipt in hand, nowhere near the location or timeline detailed in the report. Outside the door, Baines and Kellogg stood stiffly. They were used to imposing narratives, to the unquestioning glances of superiors, to excuses being filed and forgotten. But the man now inside wasn't here for explanations. He was here to establish accountability. Marcus looked directly at Harris. I want the footage from every officer's body cam at the scene. If it confirms what we saw on the mall security feed, I will forward this file to the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. No threats, just statements. Each word struck the table like a steel spike. Those in law enforcement understood when a colonel requests evidence and invokes the DOJ, it's not a bluff. It's the beginning of a federal investigation. Danielle now stood upright. Her eyes were dry. The vulnerability from moments ago had receded, replaced by a gaze sharpened by purpose, not just as someone wronged, but as a woman ready to speak on behalf of the many whose voices had been lost in the margins of falsified reports. Marcus gave her hand a gentle squeeze. Nothing more needed to be said. They walked out together, leaving behind a precinct beginning to feel the first tremors of a system being forced to confront its decay. And from that moment forward, the sky over District 18 no longer held its uneasy stillness. The storm had officially arrived, and this time it came bearing both the force of lawful reckoning and the silent fury of those who had been asked to endure for far too long. The light in the operations room shone directly over the table, casting a glare across the surface of Andre's laptop as it replayed the phone-recorded video. The footage wasn't crystal clear, but every gesture, every look, and every word was sharp enough to strip the event of its procedural disguise and expose it as an incident marked by abuse of authority. Marcus sat beside Andre, eyes locked onto every frame, not as a husband, but as a strategist trained in counterintelligence, someone who had spent years reading beyond words to detect intent through body language, micro-reactions, and silence. There was nothing in the video that suggested Danielle had been a threat to public order. Yet, the sound of handcuffs tightening, the shuffle of dragged boots, and the dismissive glances made it clear that the most basic right to be heard had been denied. Marcus showed no change in expression. He rewound the footage, pausing at the exact moment Danielle offered her identification. Neither officer looked. One glanced at it briefly, then scoffed. It was the kind of behavior that shredded any pretense of procedural integrity. Andre spoke quietly. They never read her Miranda rights, not a single word from the moment they approached to when they put her in the car. Marcus nodded, his eyes already moving inward, where deeper systemic questions had begun to form. This was no longer about two officers acting on their own. It was a clear symptom of a system that had stopped policing itself. He unlocked his encrypted phone and reopened a classified document he had accessed earlier that morning, a report from the Office of Internal Homeland Security Oversight. It listed law enforcement officers under investigation for misconduct, corruption, racially motivated behavior, or suspected ties to regional interest groups. Scrolling through, Marcus paused at two names he already knew, Scott Baines and Travis Kellogg. No mistake. Both had been flagged in past complaints 2 years earlier, tied to racially biased stops targeting black residents in West Atlanta suburbs. Each claim had been documented by civil rights watchdogs, backed by community testimonies echoing the same fear Danielle had just endured. But when Marcus tried to access the detailed case files, every link returned the same message. File not found. Records archived per Internal Affairs Directive. The sensation was familiar, like being in a combat zone where friendly communications were jammed, only to discover the interference came from inside the perimeter. Marcus looked up, voice low and even. Someone's scrubbing this from the inside. Andre glanced over, but didn't need to ask further. Marcus was connecting the dots, and each detail landed exactly where he had begun to map it in his mind. An internal chain, a network of complicity, hiding beneath titles and badges that were supposed to stand for justice. For years, he had pushed back on civil rights consultants urging the military to assist in oversight of racial bias within local police departments. His reason had always been the same. In uniform, we are colorless. We wear the same gear, and discipline rises above identity. To Marcus, honor in uniform had always come with the belief that bias had been trained out, or at least neutralized on the field. But now, as he stared at the names of the men who had just hauled his wife into a squad car, names already tied to corruption and racial harassment, that belief cracked with painful clarity. Danielle was a surgeon. She had treated wounded U.S. soldiers returning from Afghanistan, had pulled all-nighters to keep broken bodies breathing. And yet, in the middle of a shopping center in the country she served, she was treated like a threat because of the color of her skin. Marcus clenched the pen in his hand. His ideals remained intact, but it was his blind trust in the system that had allowed injustice to grow unnoticed in the shadows. And from that moment on, he understood with cold certainty, no institution is above the threat of prejudice, unless it is willing to confront it head-on. The house in East Atlanta was unnervingly quiet. Danielle sat in an armchair near the window, one arm wrapped around her knee, the other holding a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The soft glow from the living room lamp barely reached the wall lined with framed degrees and awards, each a fragment of memory once solid. Now the silent backdrop to an unrest that refused to fade. She hadn't slept all night. The image of Scott Bain's unflinching stare, that familiar smirk of men accustomed to enforcing order through bias, kept looping like a broken reel in her mind. But what disturbed her more wasn't the confrontation in the parking lot, or even the sharp exchange in the precinct. It was something deeper, older, something that had long smoldered inside her since childhood. She was born in a neighborhood just 20 minutes from downtown, yet it felt like a world apart. Her mother, Lena, worked as a janitor at an insurance office. Not a prestigious job, but she showed up 6 days a week, clinging to a paycheck barely enough to raise a child. Despite her years of service and strong work ethic, she was always paid less than her white colleagues in identical roles. Benefits were cut short, leave requests denied, and evaluations always read satisfactory, but never once promotion eligible. Danielle was young then, but children see the things adults try to hide. She saw her mother bring home cold lunches, wear weary smiles, and always say, "I'm fine. You just focus on school." And she understood. Every page she turned, every equation she solved was an answer to her mother's quiet sacrifice, a bid to escape the bottom floor of someone else's hierarchy. With that resolve, Danielle rose through a system that barely acknowledged students who looked like her. She earned a scholarship to a prestigious high school, then a place at Emory's School of Medicine, where she was one of the few black students in her cohort. She graduated near the top, completed her residency at the University Hospital, and became a cardiothoracic surgeon, a field where people like her rarely found open doors. Every step required her to be better, tougher, and more patient. And along the way, Danielle learned to live with sideways comments, with skeptical glances, with her name constantly mispronounced at conferences, as if her presence was still something to be mentioned cautiously, like an anomaly. But now, this, being stopped in broad daylight, in public, doing something as ordinary as shopping for her child, had pushed her to the far edge of endurance. Danielle set the teacup down and stepped onto the porch. The night air was cool against her skin, but not cool enough to soothe the tightness in her chest. She looked up at the Atlanta sky, not as gray as the day before, but still not bright enough to promise a real dawn. Inside her, something had shifted. Silence was no longer an option. The things her mother had once endured without protest, the losses neatly justified as not a good fit, those had now become fuel for action. Not just for herself, but for the thousands of others still denied the right to tell their own stories. At the same time, across the city, Marcus had returned to the temporary operations hub he'd established at the Southeastern Military Base. The display in front of him showed a chain of recent queries into the Precinct 18 surveillance files, where Danielle had been detained just hours earlier. One of those data access attempts had occurred only 8 minutes ago, outside the official review schedule. The login came from a high-level internal access credential restricted to just 3 individuals in the system: Lieutenant Harris, the systems administrator, and the internal affairs tech liaison. Then a red-coded alert appeared. Attempted data purge flagged. Subdirectory, incident folder, Danielle Moore detention. Marcus sat silently for a moment. His eyes scanned each line of code, each IP trace, and each timestamp. Someone inside was attempting to scrub the evidence, to erase the digital trail before Justice had a chance to speak. He didn't need to raise his voice. The command was sent through his secure channel. Lock all incident data. Activate live surveillance login. Grant full administrative oversight to Grant. On the signal map, a red icon appeared. As if the system itself had flinched, the opposing side of this unfolding battle had begun to move. Marcus clenched his fist. This war had no bullets, but every beat of silence carried the weight of a standoff at the edge of a digital storm, where one misstep could decide who preserved the truth and who buried it forever. At the Equal Liberty branch office, the glow of a computer screen lit up the tense yet resolute face of Andre Collins. Around him, audio files, images, notes, and handwritten letters were color-coded, numbered, and layered like a vascular map, each thread pulsing with the irregular heartbeat of a system damaged for years. Every marker represented a voice once silenced by doubt, fear, or indifference. But since Danielle's case, those voices were starting to rise, not trembling but firm, carried by people who had long known how to endure and now chose to stand. Andre had made contact with the fifth person in less than 48 hours. Each account struck with an eerie familiarity. A young retail worker was ordered to empty her entire handbag under the fluorescent glare of a supermarket aisle for suspicious behavior. A high school teacher was held for over 7 hours without being granted legal representation. A single mother recounts the moment Officer Baines asked for a processing fee, his voice wrapped in a half-smile, the amount more than she earned in an entire week. The list kept growing. But what shook Andre most wasn't just the severity of the abuses. It was how the women told their stories. No yelling, no dramatic outrage. Their voices were calm, low, steady, as if they had lived with humiliation long enough to make it routine. That was the real cruelty of it. A system so successful in suppressing justice that its victims stopped calling for help, no longer believing anyone would answer. Andre listened to each account, documenting everything meticulously and scheduling in-person interviews. All 5 women agreed to appear, not virtually, not anonymously, but by name, in full view, signing their statements. They chose to wear the same outfits they had once been judged for: business skirts, gray blazers, heels, pearl earrings, not for show, but to reclaim the image the system had tried to strip from them, that of dignity. Inside Equal Liberty's meeting room, the space took on the atmosphere of a private tribunal. Danielle entered first, locking eyes with each of the other women. No need for introductions, no hand-holding. Their presence alone was a declaration, silent but unmistakable, that their pain was shared and it mattered. One by one, they began to speak. Their stories are layered like clean cuts slicing into the polished myth of American freedom. Andre recorded everything using legal-grade equipment. He had attended countless hearings, but never before had he felt a gathering hum with such quiet force. These women hadn't come to weep. They came to testify that this was not a spontaneous violation, but the slow, deliberate accumulation of harm across seasons, across years, hidden behind faded ink and neglected margins. At Marcus's operations hub, the servers began receiving encrypted emails from Equal Liberty, each containing full testimonies, audio recordings, facial ID snapshots, and formal petitions to launch a broader investigation. As Marcus reached the final line of Nadia's statement, his eyes paused at her words. "I used to think I was alone, but now I know. When voices rise together, they become powerful." He printed every file, laid them out across the command table. That night, no one slept, and inside every transcript, every whispered line recorded, a fault line was forming. This time, those once called the vulnerable stood at the epicenter of a coming quake, one that would shake the foundations of a system long convinced it was untouchable. As night blanketed the western suburbs of Atlanta, a video just over 3 minutes long began to ripple through social media feeds like a needle piercing the illusion of stillness. It showed Danielle Moore being escorted by 2 white officers under the passive gaze of onlookers, her voice calm but cutting, sharp as a scalpel. The footage struck with the speed of lightning, and reactions followed fast. Not just shares and outrage in the comment sections, but personal accounts rising to the surface. From Seattle to Birmingham, From small Midwest towns to coastal cities, voices once silenced by fear or futility now rose together. A former black law student recounted being pulled over and having his car searched for wearing a hoodie in an upscale neighborhood. A female surgeon in Chicago posted about being denied access to her operating room because she didn't look like someone with a valid ID. Danielle's story was no longer an isolated event. It had become a mirror, reflecting hundreds of lives fractured by prejudice. As the online world surged with momentum, the night at a farmhouse an hour outside the city felt stiflingly still. A gray-black SUV sat outside a locked garage. Inside, under the ceiling light, the rugged face of Captain Elijah Monroe, former commander of several local precincts and current linchpin of Georgia's corruption network, stared at the man across from him, Chief Inspector Dean Forrester, bald, calm, swirling whiskey in one hand. He was Internal Affairs liaison, and the man who knew how to sink an investigation before it surfaced. There was no small talk. Monroe broke the silence like a blade. She's becoming a storm, and if we let it build, the whole structure cracks. Forrester nodded, though his eyes weren't in agreement. They were calculating. They both knew public outrage could accelerate investigations, and once Equal Liberty's pieces came together, Washington would call. And when that happened, archived records wouldn't be enough to stop the hammer. They had to act, but with no trace. Monroe pulled a worn folder from his case. Gray cover, no classified stamp, just a line of small print. Patient, RC 1.4, Kane, Richard. Only angle that might distract the public, he said, voice low. A cardiac patient who died at Atlanta Medical Center the year Danielle was appointed lead surgeon. Forrester flipped through the file, stopping at the death report. Cause undetermined. Post-anesthesia complications. Is it enough? He asked. Monroe smirked, the kind of reflex learned over years of burying things in plain sight. If we frame the question right, we don't need it to be. We just need doubt. They drafted the plan with the speed of seasoned manipulators. Re-engage auxiliary media outlets previously funded through internal grants. Leak a version of the story to a reporter known for sensational exposés, the kind who once derailed a mayoral candidate with a single blurry photo. The information wouldn't be presented as a claim, but a question that warrants a second look. They didn't need an accusation, only to put Danielle on the defensive. Forrester added a safeguard. He contacted a former hospital compliance officer, someone who'd once reviewed the incident report from the Kane surgery. A gift was delivered. A thank you fee was promised. Any detail that could absolve Danielle would simply be overlooked. History had proven many times. The public didn't need complete evidence to lose faith, only a blind spot in an otherwise clean record. She needs to be busy defending herself before she can attack, Monroe concluded, lighting a cigar with a lighter engraved with the state police emblem. If you want silence, you first dull the noise. That night, the first drafts of the re-examination story were sent to two major outlets. One editor received a clipped audio file from an anonymous source, a redacted OR recording of Danielle's voice, edited to imply hesitation in clinical decision-making. Every piece was in motion, and the opposition had made its first move. Meanwhile, at Equal Liberty, Andre had just finalized the case file for submission to the Department of Justice. In the next room, Danielle reviewed her post-op patient schedule for the week. The movement in that space was quiet, deliberate, but outside, the media battle had already begun to shift. A stone had just been cast into still water, and from it, the waves were beginning to collide. One side sought to drown the truth. The other carried the hearts of those once buried beneath it, who now refused to stay silent. That morning, the halls of Atlanta Medical Center no longer carried their usual calm. Outside the main entrance, clusters of reporters lined up with microphones, cameras, and pre-written question cards as if awaiting a trial that hadn't yet been called to session. They weren't there for a rare trauma case or a groundbreaking transplant. They had come for a name dominating headlines and political commentary the night before. Dr. Danielle Moore, a black physician, a symbol of the fight against racial bias, now under suspicion for allegedly concealing a patient's death from a cardiac surgery 3 years prior. As Danielle stepped through the hospital's glass doors, her white coat neatly pressed and her name tag gleaming as always, the air thickened around her with the pressure of 100 watchful stares. A reporter stepped forward, sharp suit, assertive voice, eyes locked in with the confidence of someone following a script. Dr. Moore, reports suggest your patient, Richard Kane, died due to a surgical error during a procedure you led in 2021. The case, as of now, remains unresolved. Are you hiding a medical mistake? For a brief second, time slowed. Colleagues inside the lobby paused, and even a few patients in the hallway stopped mid-step. But Danielle didn't flinch. Her gaze stayed level. Her voice, firm and exact, carried the weight of someone who had faced down life and death more times than most could imagine. That patient received the best care we could provide, with a full surgical team involved. If anything had been unclear, his family would have been the first to speak out, and I remain open to that conversation. I believe in transparency in medicine, just as I believe in the dignity of every person who lies on an operating table. We treat it without regard to color. But this system doesn't always do the same. Her words didn't carry anger. They carried impact, like an X-ray beam cutting through the misshapen bones of a broken narrative. Within 2 hours, a video of her response went viral. Hashtags erupted across platforms. I stand with Dr. Moore, Justice in white coats, Stop Medical Bias. An image of Danielle, calm and composed in her white coat, standing firm before a wall of cameras, became a new emblem of a generation of black medical professionals no longer willing to stay quiet, where medical charts could write 2 different outcomes depending on the color of the patient or the doctor. Yet, when the media glare receded and the supportive messages faded back into voicemail inboxes, Danielle returned to her apartment as though passing through another threshold, into a space where no spotlight could erase old scars. In that silence, an old, unresolved question returned with its quiet weight. Had she done enough? Richard Kane, the patient on her table 3 years earlier, had been one of her first high-risk cases as a newly appointed lead surgeon. Danielle remembered vividly the look in his wife's eyes outside the OR, holding a photo Richard had sent from his offshore rig job. The surgery hadn't been successful, and though all clinical data pointed to complications from a congenital heart defect, that memory remained a slow-burning line in her conscience. Now, as the case was dragged back into light, not by those who cared about medical truth, but by those seeking to smear her integrity, that scar throbbed with new clarity. She wasn't panicked, but cracks had begun to form in the trust she held, not just in the system but in herself. Danielle sat at the edge of her bed, hands interlocked, eyes fixed on the corner of the room, where her medical degree still hung beside a photo of her late mother, smiling with pride, never having lived to see the storms her daughter would have to weather just to stand where she stood now. Marcus entered just as the last trace of sunset faded beyond the balcony. He said nothing at first. He poured her a glass of water, then sat beside her, his shoulder touching hers like an anchor dropped quietly in a storm. "I know you've kept every thank you letter from your patients' families," he began, his voice barely more than a breath. "And I also know you remember every name you couldn't save. But justice isn't built on guilt. It needs people strong enough not to turn their hearts into prisons." Danielle lifted her head, her eyes filled with tears. Marcus stood and left her the space she needed. He believed in her, he knew she would rise. Her fingers reached for the corner of a photo frame on the shelf. Eileen Moore, radiant in a pale floral dress, smiling with quiet triumph. The photo was taken at Danielle's medical school graduation at the moment her name was called, and the white coat was placed on her shoulders for the first time. Her mother had sat in the audience, silent for a moment, before smiling in a way that made the world slow down for Danielle. It wasn't just a mother's pride. It was living proof that 40 years of sacrifice by a black woman had found their rightful destination. In the warm, dim light of her desk lamp, Danielle opened the old wooden box with the tiny brass lock, a habit she learned from her mother. Keep beautiful things for the hardest days. The first letter was from a boy named Aiden, a 9-year-old born with a heart defect, his handwriting uneven with reversed letters. "You're my superhero doctor. Now I can run faster than Tom." Another letter came from an elderly man named Javier, who had sobbed the first time he stood on his own in the ICU. He had placed a trembling hand on Danielle's shoulder and said, "You didn't just save me. You saved my wife. She no longer has to fear losing her husband in the middle of the night." Every line, every smudge of ink still carried the tremor of hands clinging to life, and together they began to rekindle a quiet but unshakable light inside her. Amid accusations and dirty tactics, media frenzy, and revived doubt, it was these voices, Aiden's, Javier's, her mother's silent smile, that formed the strongest seawall she had ever known. Danielle sat upright, carefully folding each letter like lifting pieces of memory that had kept her from sinking. In her mind, now was not just the image of a doctor under siege, but of a woman who had been trusted by others to guard their lives, and who had returned that trust time and again with skill, compassion, and a will no storm could break. That night, as the city sank into quiet, Danielle remained at her desk, reopening Richard Kane's old medical file. She reviewed every metric, every note, as if reoperating on memory itself. With care, she flagged points that could be misread and added clinical explanations beside each decision, not to defend herself, but to prepare. The following morning, Atlanta Medical Center released a press statement with the clarity and precision of a clinical report. An independent review board confirmed that the surgery performed on patient Richard Kane had followed proper protocol, with all vital metrics closely monitored. The complication that led to his death stemmed from a rare congenital heart defect, and the complete medical file had been preserved according to regulation. The statement ended with a resolute line: "We stand with the truth and those who dedicate their lives to healing." Just as the narrative threatened to dissolve into the fog of manipulated media, it shifted. Some reporters took their stories down. Others reached out, now requesting full interviews. But Danielle remained silent. She returned to the hospital, revisited former patients, and reviewed training protocols with her residents. Public scrutiny began to subside, but within Marcus, a different fire was building. Not one of anger, but of an awakening refined through the bruises etched onto the woman he loved. That evening, inside a secondary operations office set up at Fort McPherson, Marcus activated a wide display screen, lighting up a network map linking federal agencies, civil rights organizations, and internal military investigative units. Across the top of the classified briefing he had just finalized, one name ran in bold: Operation Fairground. The document would never be printed. It existed only within a secured system accessible by a select few: Colonel Marcus Grant, a handful of senior federal prosecutors, and representatives from Equal Liberty and the NAACP. The operation was structured around 3 pillars: legal action, media strategy, and prevention. The goal wasn't just to hold individuals accountable, it was to dismantle the roots of a protection network that had festered beneath the floorboards of local law enforcement. One by one, Marcus presented the findings. officers with concealed complaints, cases quietly archived by internal directive, irregular fund transfers linked to private security contractors. The map is filled with red nodes, each representing a precinct, not guardians of order, but potential gears in a machine exploiting the vulnerable for institutional gain. Inside the war room, Marcus didn't read the report word for word. He briefed the room like a combat commander, laying out a tactical mission. The confidence in his voice didn't come from his rank. It came from the ache that had carved itself into his chest when he saw his wife treated like a threat in the country she had fought to protect, one patient at a time. He no longer saw himself as an outsider in this fight. Now, as a husband, a soldier, and a citizen, Marcus understood what was truly at stake. It wasn't just personal honor, but a core principle of any civilized nation. Justice does not get to choose a skin color. After his presentation, federal prosecutor Leon Mendoza, an Asian American attorney with a sharp gaze and a reputation for zero compromise, gave a firm nod. The evidence is sufficient to request an expansion into a statewide investigation. But we need corroboration from witnesses. Andre, joining remotely from Equal Liberty, had already prepared the list. 6 witnesses ready to sign affidavits, plus 2 former officers who had resigned in protest over race-based targeting protocols. They were critical nodes, people who had once operated in the shadows, now ready to step into the light. Marcus closed the meeting with a single, unwavering directive. Starting tomorrow, financial audits will proceed alongside the recovery of archived case files. Any anomalies, any deletion not logged, must be reconstructed through independent forensic algorithms. The meeting ended at midnight. Marcus remained alone, surrounded by maps, reports, and the glow of 3 monitors. In his heart, a line from Danielle's mother echoed, a story she had once shared with him early in their marriage. A black woman never walks through a door alone. She carries generations behind her. Now, Marcus carried a part of that burden too, not just as a man who loved her, but as one who understood he was standing at the intersection of justice and devotion. At exactly 4:30 a.m., the main screen in the operations room at Fort McPherson lit up with a red banner. Data breach alert. Classified route exposed. The warning didn't just appear on Marcus's monitor. It cascaded across every encrypted device linked to the operation. The breach had come from an internal login. The IP traced back to the one person Marcus had trusted most in his unit, Major Grace Holloway. Marcus didn't look away from the data stream pouring across the screen. His fingers pressed into the cold edge of the metal desk. Grace, his partner from Afghanistan, the soldier who'd carried wounded through a barrage in Kandahar, was the one leaking information to the other side. The encrypted messages, peeled back line by line, revealed a clandestine link between Holloway and the network behind Captain Elijah Monroe. The plan, Marcus, federal prosecutors, and Equal Liberty had built over 3 painstaking weeks, was now in enemy hands. The air in the room thickened, like the haze after a blast. Marcus drew a breath, then gave a single command into his headset: emergency protocol. Switch to the alternate plan, now. From the upper levels, the security teams moved like a silent wave. Contingency plans were unsealed, each unit rerouted through backup frequencies, their positions scrambled and reassigned. Within 15 minutes, the entire operation shifted from defense to an offensive posture. Operation Fairground had entered active engagement. Across the city, in a quiet apartment on Atlanta's east side, Danielle woke suddenly, as if pulled from sleep by instinct alone. No ringing phone, no beam of light. Yet she sat up, her eyes turning toward the home office where Marcus often stayed late, surrounded by maps and strategic layouts. The door creaked softly. Marcus stood in uniform, a radio on his shoulder and his gaze fixed on the small screen strapped to his wrist where unit positions updated in real time. He walked carefully, not intending to wake her. But Danielle was already standing. She didn't ask what had happened. The more important question lies in the future. "I'm coming with you." Marcus met her eyes. The resolve in them needed no elaboration. He had seen that same look every time she entered an OR with a critical case, every time someone whispered behind her back about the first black woman to lead emergency cardiac surgery at Atlanta Medical. "Danielle, this isn't like before." "Exactly. That's why I can't stand aside." A second passed, long enough to stretch an hour. Then she stepped forward, placing a hand firmly on his shoulder, her voice low and sharp, slicing through every fear that might have tried to hold her back. "I'm not a side character in my own story." That sentence, short, clear, cut straight through the narrative Marcus had thought he was guiding. He looked at her, perhaps for the first time in months, not just as his wife, not just as a doctor, but as a leader in her own right, someone whose voice had learned to stand even when shackled and scrutinized. As they drove toward command, the city still cloaked in pre-dawn gray, the sun not yet climbing the skyline, a tactical map glowed between them, illuminating their faces in shifting tones of blue. And for the first time since the media storm began, Danielle didn't feel like she was dodging it. She was stepping directly into its center. At the base, her arrival shifted the tone of the entire command room. Some of the younger officers stood instinctively, eyes flicking from surprise to respect as they recognized the woman who had once made a nation stop and reconsider in a single, fraught morning in May, now walking in with her head held high, shoulder to shoulder with the man leading the largest coordinated push against local police corruption since the Rodney King investigation. Marcus stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Operation Fairground is now fully active. All data retrieval routes are switching to secure frequency. We strike on 3 fronts: legal, media, and witness-based. And as of this moment, Dr. Danielle Moore will serve as direct advisor to this operation on public strategy and crisis communications." No one questioned it. Danielle's presence left no space for doubt, and in that brief moment, the projector screen flashed with the now infamous image from the precinct, the one of her in handcuffs. She looked at it once more, not to defend herself, but to prepare to strike back. At exactly 5:30 a.m., just before the first light of morning spilled over the rooftops of East Atlanta, 3 coordinated task forces activated in perfect unison. From the sky, Black Hawk helicopters, unmarked, low-flying, swept across the tree-lined outskirts of River Oaks, descending upon the fortified mansion of Chief Inspector Dean Forrester. Once disguised by manicured trees and luxury gates, the property now stood exposed, a polished shell built to hide a man who had grown far too comfortable moving in the shadows. Simultaneously, to the city's west, the 2nd Strike Unit closed in on a lakeside home belonging to Captain Elijah Monroe, once a supposed retreat, now revealed as the covert nerve center for deals between corrupt officers and private prison contractors. Nearly 50 miles north, the 3rd Team descended on the palatial estate of Deputy Secretary Alan Pierce, long considered untouchable due to political connections stretching to the northeastern corridors of power. Each of the 3 targets had been marked weeks prior, but the operational timetable remained encrypted until the final hour to eliminate any chance of a leak. Marcus personally coordinated from the command center, eyes fixed on the digital war map, each moving dot representing a strike unit tightening its grip like a massive clamp, leaving no path of escape. On the big screen, footage streamed directly from body cams mounted on strike helmets, door codes breached in 4 seconds, first entry through the garage, second from the rear. Every movement was silent, surgical. Only breath and brief command signals cut in the dark. In River Oaks, Forrester awoke to the cold metallic tap of a battering ram against his door. Seconds later, flashlight beams sliced through his bedroom. He never had time to resist. His wrists were bound to the bed, the same cold cuffs he once believed were made only for troublemakers out there. The face that once held court in closed-door meetings, using his controlled baritone to redirect investigations into dead ends, now looked ghostly pale against the satin sheets. As he was led through his hallway, his eyes fell on files scattered across the floor, racially profiled patrol targets, logs of payments from operational contractors, residential maps marked with notes about disruption allowances. Each document shredded the illusion he had spent decades crafting. Forrester muttered, his voice barely a whisper, a reflexive gasp from someone who had always pulled the strings. If they hadn't touched her, I'd still be safe. The words hung in the gray morning light like an accidental confession. It marked a turning point. The moment once disconnected fragments finally aligned. Sharp, undeniable. At Monroe's estate, the story was the same. He was stepping out of the pool when the unit stormed in. Soaked sleepwear clung to his skin, and the arrogance that once defined his gaze vanished as he was pinned to the marble floor. Satellite phones, coded transaction ledgers, and hard drives containing flagged profiles of targeted civilians were confiscated in front of him, each item a silent indictment. At Alan Pierce's estate, a small resistance from private guards was swiftly neutralized. An underground document-shredding bunker was sealed off just in time. Inside, prosecutors recovered logs linking Pierce and Forrester, with timestamps, locations, and full transcripts of budget reallocation meetings framed around population management potential, a euphemism for systemic control. Back at command, Marcus received confirmation from all three teams. No casualties, all targets secured. He clenched his hand briefly, then instructed the media unit to launch the first wave of public releases, not through national outlets but through community platforms where the unheard could finally speak. Outside the window, the sun had begun to push past the mist over the city's rooftops. But this dawn was not just another morning. It was a marker, a rupture in the status quo, a full system awakening where justice was no longer abstract. It moved with the force of real footsteps, broke through real doors, and glared into the daylight with nothing left to hide. The large screen in the operations room was still lit as dawn bathed the streets of Atlanta. Danielle stood silently in front of the live feed, Forrester being escorted from his mansion, his eyes wide like a man yanked out of a world he once believed untouchable. Monroe, seated between two military police officers, behind him a desk buried in damning evidence. Alan Pierce, once calm and composed in congressional hearings, now frozen under the glare of prosecutorial floodlights. Danielle traced a finger along the edge of the screen, as if to commit each frame to memory, not to celebrate, but to remember. In her eyes shimmered not triumph, but a quiet, deeper reckoning. She thought of the thousands of black lives that had stepped into interrogation rooms without witnesses, who had stood in handcuffs on city streets, surrounded by suspicion. People who didn't have a Marcus Grant behind them. No, Andre Collins is watching from afar. No camera captured the pivotal moment. Today's victory delivered justice to the surface. But beneath it, the collective memory of marginalized communities still bore the names of Sandra Bland, Elijah McClain, and countless others, stamped with insufficient evidence. What was needed now went far beyond retribution. It demanded real reform. Marcus stepped behind her and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. No questions were needed. He understood. Danielle turned, her gaze dry but resolute. Her voice was low but firm. If I go back to surgery, there'll still be others like me who have to put down their scalpel just to walk outside and defend themselves. I need to do something so that no one has to trade their safety just to be seen as human. Marcus didn't argue. He had seen too much at the front line himself. Altered reports, race-based quotas, apologies that came too late when the wounds were already deep. And, like her, he knew that winning one battle didn't bring peace. It was only the start of a longer war against habit, bias, and inertia. That same week, a new legislative draft was submitted to the Georgia State Assembly. The Grant-Moore Protocol was born from a conversation between two people. One, a doctor once handcuffed outside a shopping mall. The other, a military officer who once believed a uniform could shield against injustice. The proposed bill had three key provisions: mandatory anti-racism training for all law enforcement at every level, round-the-clock camera surveillance inside police precincts, with independent access granted to civilian oversight bodies, and the creation of a community review board where citizens would have the right to monitor, investigate, and make recommendations on all cases involving abuse of power or racially motivated misconduct. At the official announcement, the state's spokesperson stepped up to the microphone and declared, "For the first time in our state's history, a justice reform bill is being authored by someone who has experienced injustice firsthand, not just by lawmakers from above." Danielle accepted the appointment as State Secretary for Human Rights. The decision surprised many, especially former colleagues who had known her for her passion for surgery, not politics. But for her, scalpels and statutes were simply different instruments, both used to restore life. At her swearing-in, a young black medical student from southern Alabama handed her a letter. "You didn't have to save me with your hands," it read. "You saved me with your presence, your courage, and for saying what generations before me never dared to say." Marcus, too, was honored. For the first time in his 17-year military career, he was promoted to general for leading a national anti-racism initiative. The Department of Defense, the FBI, and civil rights coalitions jointly entrusted him to coordinate the federal reform network. On his new badge, he saw a reflection that was no longer just military prestige, but the weight of history pressing from both sides. One day after the ceremony, Marcus and Danielle returned home. No cameras, no helicopters overhead. Just a quiet, golden afternoon falling over the same porch where Danielle had once sat sleepless after her arrest. No tears, no words, only eyes searching the sky, wondering whether her voice held any meaning in a world so loud. She didn't have to ask that anymore. Her voice had been heard by a system that once tried to silence it. Danielle took her cup of tea. Her hands still bore the calluses of surgical years, but in her eyes glimmered a new softness, a faith reborn through fire. "I don't know how far I'll go," she said, "but at least today I'm standing in the right place." Marcus nodded. He said nothing more, because from that moment on, both of them understood their lives would never return to what they once were. But in exchange, thousands more would be free to live theirs, with dignity and without fear. On a quiet Friday morning, as Atlanta still lay under a thin veil of early spring mist, a single envelope appeared among the thick stack of policy files on Danielle's desk at the office of the Secretary of State. The sender's name was handwritten, simple, and brief: Michael Caine. The letters were rounded, careful, not decorative, but deliberate, like someone had practiced them many times before, gathering the courage to write. Danielle stared at the name for a long moment. It was the surname of the man she had once been accused of killing, Richard Caine, the patient whose surgical death had been resurrected in a political smear campaign, not by truth, but by those terrified of it. Her fingers brushed the textured envelope, paper rough like something worn down by wind and time. She opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet. No title, no small talk, just a short paragraph. but one that held more peace than she'd found in months of chaos. My name is Michael Kane, son of Richard Kane, who passed away during surgery under your care 3 years ago. Last week, we saw your name brought up again in the news, dragged into a storm we thought had ended. I want to be clear. My family never blamed you, and before my father went into surgery, he told me, if anyone can get me through this, it's Dr. Moore. And we've always known you did everything you could. No one can save everyone, but those who listen, who try, who face pain instead of running from it, they are the ones who truly heal. You are one of them, and I think my father would smile knowing I wrote you this letter. Danielle read each word like it had been written in heartbeat ink, not black. She didn't blink, so the tears wouldn't fall too quickly. She didn't shudder. She breathed deeply, kept her shoulders steady, and folded the letter with both hands, slowly, gently, like folding a white coat used to save a life. In the months prior, she had often asked herself, did she truly deserve to stand in the spotlight, championing the Grant Moore protocol, when she still bore the scar of a surgery that ended in loss? She had carried that question like a shadow into every meeting, behind every speech, into every pair of eyes that looked at her with admiration. She had never denied her responsibility, but peace had always stayed just out of reach. Until now. Until Michael's words arrived, not loud, but warm, like light spilling through spring curtains. She placed the letter in a private drawer, the one where she kept items with no legal weight but immense emotional worth. Marcus walked in and immediately noticed something different about her. Not glowing, not burdened, something softer. He didn't ask. Danielle handed him the letter. No words needed. He read it, nodded, and sat beside her. Between them, silence. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the letter had already said it all. Marcus was a man of action, but in that moment, he understood. Sometimes a real victory isn't measured by how many cases are exposed, but by the quiet mending of a human heart, stretched thin, but finally seen. That same afternoon, Danielle requested a visit to a local trauma support center for survivors of systemic violence. She didn't go as Secretary Moore. She didn't go to take photos or give speeches. She sat in a therapy circle, listening. A middle-aged black woman shared about being pulled over for suspicious plates, then having her bag searched in front of her daughter. A young girl spoke about being held for 8 hours without cause, now unable to enter a grocery store without panic rising in her chest. Danielle didn't interrupt. She only spoke once, at the end, when the facilitator asked if anyone had something lasting to share. She raised her hand. I used to think truth was the clearest thing in the world, she said, but I've learned it needs someone brave enough to protect it. And to do that, we have to start by protecting each other. The room fell still. No applause. Just one woman next to her, quietly squeezing Danielle's hand. And for the first time since her arrest, her skin was touched not by suspicion, but by empathy. On her way out, a small girl waited by the door, maybe 13, tight curls pulled into a neat ponytail, eyes bright with the kind of wisdom adults often spend years trying to earn. Are you Dr. Moore? Danielle nodded. I want to be a heart surgeon. Like you, Danielle smiled. Then study hard. And remember, our hearts aren't just for saving others. They're also for listening. The girl nodded firmly, then ran to her mother. Danielle stood watching her go and felt something she hadn't felt so clearly before, that what kept her going wasn't titles or bills named after her. It was the small pulses, those quiet heartbeats of belief, renewed after surviving the dark. In her hands, Michael Kane's letter was still warm. It offered no apology. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It simply told the truth, that truth doesn't need applause. It needs to be kept, so that someone, somewhere, might step forward one day, still whole and still believing. Morning sunlight filtered through the maple trees lining the gates of the Georgia Police Academy, casting warm lines across the stone steps where the rows of honor seats had just been set. Danielle stepped out of the car in a deep navy suit, simple, yet bearing the quiet authority shaped by time and the battles for justice she had faced. It had been a year since she stood in a parking lot, wrists bound, head held high like a silent declaration that they could arrest her body, but not the truth. Now, walking alongside Marcus, now a major general and national commander of the police reform force, she returned to what had once been a closed-door institution of the old system, to witness the first graduating class born under the Grant Moore Protocol. This year's graduation was unlike any other. Of the more than 300 cadets, nearly half were women, and 43% came from racial backgrounds historically pushed to the margins of power. These numbers weren't just in a report. They were standing tall, with pressed Navy uniforms, proud postures, and steady eyes. Like the scar on Danielle's wrist, those figures bore witness to a painful past and promised the possibility of healing. On stage, the Academy director called Danielle to speak. Applause rippled through the audience. Not thunderous, but reverent. She stepped up to the mic, took a breath, and scanned the rows of cadets, young faces full of ambition, uniforms crisp, eyes forward. She knew some of them came from neighborhoods like hers, where parents warned them to walk the long way if they saw a squad car, where neighbors were dragged from homes in the night over mistaken identity. But today, they stood inside the system to change it from within. Danielle didn't use grand rhetoric. She chose to tell a story. A year ago, I was handcuffed in broad daylight. At the time, I didn't imagine that what I went through would ever become a reason for someone to join law enforcement. I just knew I had to survive, to tell the truth exactly as it happened. She paused, glancing at Marcus. He nodded, a small familiar gesture between two people who had shared foxholes and dreams. But I've since realized not all change comes from resistance. A large part of justice starts with where you choose to stand when it's your turn to decide. The courtyard went still. No phones rang, no whispers, just flags rustling gently in the breeze, and hundreds of eyes fixed on her, not because of her title, but because they, too, were beginning a journey. You will be entrusted with power, the very thing this system once abused. But that power is not for control, it is for protection. Remember, a badge does not define your honor. The way you make people feel safe does. As she stepped down, the applause grew fuller now, sustained. But what struck Danielle most wasn't the sound. It was the look in a young black cadet's eyes as he approached her. He stopped, stood straight, and gave a crisp salute. She nodded in return. "Because you were arrested that day," he said softly, "I chose to become someone who upholds justice from within." Danielle had no words. In that instant, she felt the full weight and worth of a pain that had once been forced into silence. Now it had become someone else's reason to speak. Marcus joined her. They stood together, looking up at the academy wall, where a new inscription had been carved into the stone. "In service of all, in justice for all." A simple line, but if believed in and lived out, it could shift the axis of an entire civilization. That evening, there was no champagne, no gala. Marcus and Danielle returned to the wooden house where it had all begun. On the porch, the late sun painted the walls gold, lighting up the photo of their family and the American flag awarded by the president after Operation Fairground. Danielle held her tea, leaned back in the wicker chair, her voice barely louder than the wind through the pines. "I used to think the end of injustice was a verdict. Now I understand. It's graduation." Marcus smiled. "And every cadet in that class is a comma, carrying forward the sentence we started." From that porch, laughter echoed, once silenced by grief, now filling the space where silence no longer meant pain, but possibility, hope, awareness, and the quiet promise of an America where no one is judged by skin, gender, or origin. As night fell, Marcus closed the balcony door and gently pulled the curtain shut. City lights cast a soft glow across the living room. On the table sat Michael Caine's letter, beside today's speech, two pieces of the same journey, which began with a pair of handcuffs and arrived at an oath. But, in Danielle's heart, nothing had truly ended. She knew. Tomorrow she would return to her desk, continue revising clauses in the law. Marcus would continue overseeing investigations, and those new officers would begin their first patrols, not searching for people who fit a profile, but protecting people who simply live. This story had no full stop, because justice, when it truly begins, is always a sentence that continues. Danielle Moore's story didn't end with the applause at graduation. It lives on in every step taken by the new officers she helped inspire, in each line of legislation she continues to revise, and in the eyes of black children who, for the first time, feel safe when they see a police officer walk by. Danielle was dragged down once by prejudice, but she didn't choose revenge. She chose to rewrite the rules, not to win alone, but to open the door for thousands to step into a more just America. And what about you? When you see injustice, will you turn away or become the one who changes it from within? If this story spoke to something in you, like, share, and subscribe, so that stories like this don't fade into silence but become real change, one voice at a time.